have time for that at 12:15 this afternoon after we've gotten through the bulk of our conversation. If you're a member of the public, we do ask you to leave your camera off until that point. And if you would like to speak to the subcommittee, I would ask that you drop a message in the chat to Carrie Steele or myself, Barrick Abramson. On the note of the chat, unless it is something urgent, we do ask that everyone avoid using the chat function at all during these meetings. It can be distracting for all of our participants. It can lead to people not necessarily following the conversation, and it's particularly distracting for folks using a screen reader or other technology. So we just try to avoid using the chat unless absolutely necessary. Final administrative piece, I will ask that when you speak, you introduce yourself so everyone knows who's talking, both those on the call and anyone who may be listening while they drive or following along on YouTube or other means. With that, I'm going to talk about today's agenda. I'm really excited with where we are in these conversations. We have spent 5 months now really digging into the charge we were given by House Bill 1296. We have heard from a ton of really smart experts, from developers of programs to folks over at CHAFA, some things around finance. We've talked with people with lived experience. Now is the turning point we talked about last month when we start taking all of that learning and putting ideas on the table. So I want to set expectations in terms of what we want to do over these next few months and with each meeting. At each meeting, we're going to go deep into one aspect of our charge, or in some cases, one of the pieces you have surfaced as members that you think is particularly important to address. For example, we have been charged with addressing the availability, the inventory of housing. Folks have talked about the need for plain language contracts and ease of communications. At each of our meetings between now and August, we're going to go deep into those areas of inquiry. We're going to develop what are possible solutions. And you're going to hear me use that phrase repeatedly, possible solutions. We are not in these meetings going to be voting up or down on recommendations. What we want to do is develop a list of ideas that could address the barrier that has been identified in legislation or in our conversations. We're then going to take those ideas, and it may be multiple ideas. You may say one way to address this would be to require every city to collect this data. You may say, we don't want to require the cities, we want the state to collect all this data. We will take that small set of ideas that could be solutions, put them up on the Engage Dora website, and work with all of you, the broader task force, to share those ideas out with as many stakeholders as possible. We want to hear from advocates. We want to hear from the business community. We want to hear from developers. We want to hear from people with lived experience, what they think of those ideas. On that note, when I say what they think of those ideas, just like we are not going to be voting yes or no on any one of those during the summer conversations, we're not going to ask members of the public to do so either. What we will do is say, these are some ideas that the subcommittee has been discussing, and we'll ask for their reactions. We'll ask things like, what do you see as the strengths of this potential solution? What do you see in terms of concerns or the implications? What might be some of the methods of oversight or compliance? All of that is intended to provide us more feedback from all of these different stakeholders to bring back to you. So at one meeting, we'll develop these potential solutions. We'll get them up on Engage Dora within 2 weeks of us having the conversation. We'll go socialize them with a lot of stakeholders. And at the next meeting, we'll bring all of that feedback to all of you. So you can talk then about how you may want to refine those ideas, narrow them down, and that will all contribute to what will become the shorter list of ideas that by the end of the summer going into the fall, we will then be asking you to vote on a set of recommendations to make in a report to the executive committee of this task force. When it comes to those recommendations, we will be providing both a majority and a minority opinion to the task force. I would love to see us get to consensus, if not unanimous consensus on all of the ideas, but if we don't, we will share the perspective of all of the members of this subcommittee with the executive committee so they can consider those. With that, let me take a big break and I'm going to grab a drink of water. I would love any questions you have or thoughts about this process we're going to be going through over the next few months. I am seeing and reading none, so I am going to dive us right into the conversation. I'm trying to walk us a little up the easy path to begin with. We're going to get into some very difficult conversations in terms of, are you going to recommend specific numbers or percentages of units? What are we doing around financing? What data do we need? Today, we're going to focus on the accessibility of information, including contracts and communications. There's been some discussion about plain language contracts. There's been some conversation about even the accessibility of the information about available units, whether that's from private developers, whether that's from housing authorities, where that information is posted, how easy it is to read and understand, and if it's accessible to people depending on their abilities. So today's conversation is really about the accessibility of information and the communications from developers, from state agencies, and all information about accessible housing. I would first invite folks to have a conversation before we start floating ideas of possible solutions or things you may want to require. But let's do a little bit of a conversation about what all you think we want to address in a conversation about the accessibility of information and communications. Just what things should we be addressing in that? Cassidy, jump in.
Yeah, I think obviously a big thing that comes to mind here is like plain language contracts, specifically lease agreements, like addendums, leases, HOA contracts. I think just having like a plain language document that accompanies some of the like legalistic contract language, I think could be useful. I don't know really about like the concept of like entirely replacing such contracts with something that's more simplified, but creating like a resource that goes with these housing contracts.
And I'll take us in a few minutes. Thank you, Cassidy. We're going to start really digging into what you may want to consider as a recommendation and what the mechanisms of enforcement or compliance or the mechanism lever of change. But I'm hearing clearly that one of these categories we want to talk about today is recommendations around plain language contracts. And it sounds like of all kinds, whether those are leases, purchase agreements, HOA agreements, but the plain language agreements relating to housing and homes. Who else has kind of a bucket that you think we need to cover? And we're not at the solutions idea phase just yet. We'll get there in a few minutes. Oh, what are you thinking we want to make sure we cover?
Hi, it's Paul. I guess just standard templates for these things that we can rely on, and then also resources or a hotline maybe that provides people assistance when they need it.
We had some conversations earlier in the spring. Folks were asking about the format and forms of communication. And as I recall looking at my notes, it was things about, I don't always know when there are units available somewhere, and where it's posted isn't accessible or isn't standardized. So are communications about unit availability something that you all think that we should be covering? I see Cassidy shaking her head, others. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the Division of Housing at one point tried to develop a list of accessible units where they had provided some of the financing, but getting owners and property management companies to keep that up to date made it not very useful. But that is something that would be useful, because in particular for accessible units, it can be very, especially the ones that are more affordable tend to be older properties. And so you need to know, have they made any of their units accessible? And when those accessible units become available, do they actively recruit a person who needs those accessibility features? Those are the things that make it hard. So like when I've worked transitioning people out of nursing facilities who are wheelchair users or who have some sort of mobility impairments, being able to find an accessible unit spread, where they're kind of not all concentrated in basically disability ghettos, but where they're spread in, um, um, just across the universe of housing, um, so that people can get their located a unit and then make sure that the services that they need are available in that particular area. But I know the Division of Housing tried really hard to get that going. That would be something that would be, to me, very useful, because there are accessible units out there. We have no idea where. And then our property management companies working very hard to recruit people who could use those units.
Yeah. Cassidy, jump in.
Yeah, and to go off of that concept, I think it would be really useful to know what accessibility features are in the apartment. Because when we are talking about accessibility, as we visited at the beginning of the subcommittee meetings, like it could mean a variety of different things for folks, and folks have a variety of different needs. So while some people with disabilities may benefit from certain features, those would be, not helpful and in fact a barrier to other folks. So I think just highlighting the exact features and maybe trying to bake that into what's communicated about unit availability.
You're going to have, in these conversations, I'm going to be asking a lot of what could be viewed as leading questions. It's really just me looking back at 60 pages of notes and wanting to jog memories and make sure we're covering all ideas. We had some previous conversation around communications about how to get, whether it's adaptations made or accessibility modifications made, and the communications clear about that. Is that something that we want to explore today?
This is Cassidy. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, Derek.
Yeah, the issue was raised by a member of the subcommittee on one of our calls this spring, that sometimes individuals don't know either their rights or who to contact and how to contact someone about getting an accessibility modification made. And I'm just resurfacing that to see if that's something you want to put on the list today of plain language communications and accessible communications.
I think so.
And this is Brian. I think just as a general idea, that having a sense or having a clearinghouse or somewhere beyond the advocacy groups that know how folks can know their rights and express those rights. I think that's an important component of this. So, whether that is, we live in the digital age. So, whether that's, something that's easily accessible online or, whatever it might be, like just a clearinghouse for folks to know, what are your rights when it comes to, sorry, a pop-up screen just said I'm speaking in another language, so I feel crazy about that. Just a know your rights kind of space. And I know that our advocacy groups here in Colorado are really strong, but they're also limited in their capacity. So,
yeah, thank you, Brian. I've got this idea down that we'll discuss then today around a clearinghouse on rights and a simple place to go. I'm going to bring us back to where we started then, and we're going to start digging into specific ideas. And again, just to remind us, today we're focused on this piece around accessibility of information, contracts, communications, and rights. And our goal is to develop a series of possible solutions. Again, we're not voting on the recommendations. So you may have 1, 2, or 3 that all address the same barrier in different ways, and then we'll stakehold these and socialize them to get different reactions. The first one everyone identified was around contracts, and particularly plain language in contracts. And this group spoke of everything from leases to purchase agreements to contracts with HOAs or rental management operations. So I want to go deep and specific on this, thinking about things that you think we may want to consider asking the state of Colorado to play a role in requiring. And as we talk about this, we'll talk about what that role may be. Is it going to be an enforced requirement by the state? And if so, are we enforcing it on private individuals, on municipalities? And I ask this just because I'm going to ask us to get very specific about what you think we may want to ask the state to require or do. And if there is a means of enforcement or of compliance and oversight, what you think that may look like. But let's get really specific on plain language contracts and accessible contracts. What are some specific things that you might want to see either the legislature adopt and pass laws on, or otherwise the state require?
Don't everyone jump in at once.
Several years ago, the legislature made some changes to lease agreements to try to make them more understandable, but I think that work could continue. Everybody wants to cover their bases legally to limit their risk, especially in this insurance market. But if we could find a way to work with like the apartment association or somebody, other people that are interested in that, to try to make these contracts much more straightforward and understandable to people who may have some limited ability to understand contracts that are written above a 5th or a 6th grade level.
So David and other members, I'm going to ask you to lean in on this with me. If we were going to go socialize an idea or a potential change to what the state requires, would the idea be that the state of Colorado require all lease agreements to be in plain language that is easily understandable with minimal legalese? What would we ask the state to require of these? And Paul, you've got your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to lean in on this conversation around plain language contracts.
I guess I just wanted to echo the comment about the apartment association. I've been trying to figure out if there's standard forms. It does look like the Colorado Apartment Association does have some. They're access protected. You have to be a member to see them. So I don't know what content is on them, but a review and understanding of how accessible the language is in those documents. And maybe if it's not trusted that the apartment association hold those documents, maybe Colorado establish a standard form or something in lieu of that.
So we had a couple potential ideas, and again, we're not voting that, hey, this is the idea this group all agrees with. It's what do we want to go get some stakeholder ideas on. One is requiring that all lease agreements be in plain language. One could be, if I'm hearing you, that the state of Colorado develop and provide a model lease agreement in plain language. I also heard, I think, between the lines of what other folks were saying, ensuring that all lease agreements are published in accessible form. Are those three consistent with what everyone is thinking so far as we continue to develop these?
I agree, and want to make sure as far as the accessible form, some of that accessible form may need to be beyond electronic because not everybody has access to be able to read electronic forms on their phone, or they may not even have the ability to access the internet on their phone. They just use it for calls.
I appreciate you naming that. Yeah.
Eric, I want to just like, as an operator or owner of
Yeah.
affordable housing developments, how does this play out? That's my question to you. Is so is this all lease agreements change for anyone that is doing rental housing, or is it someone coming in saying I have accessibility needs, or that's when it triggers a new form or a different approach? So understanding, like, you think about, how that plays out at the, because I think any person could say, when you look at a lease agreement, it's complex, even for someone who's college educated, so it's, I think that's what, as we think about what we're saying we'd like to see happen, how does that impact the owner operator?
Yeah. And Shelley, I appreciate the question, and I want to be very clear. I don't have an opinion on which one of those should be. What I want to push all of you to do is offer what may be multiple variations of that to go get that stakeholder impact, to hear from developers, to hear from those living with a disability, to hear from folks in the legal community about which one of those it should be. So you may put forward two competing ideas. There may be one that says every lease as of January 1st, 2026 must be in plain language, must comply with this, and must be in these different accessible forms. Or you might say Colorado must develop and make available, and it is optional. And I'm not here to say which ones. What I want from all of you is, what ideas do you want to go get some reaction and response from? I'm going to ask you to give a little thought to what ideas you may want to put on the table while I go to Cassidy and then Representative Ortiz.
Yeah, I just had kind of a thought in response to what Shelley had just said. I think, like, putting the burden on people to request this would create an additional problem. So I think having it be available to everyone as a norm is something I would lean in favor of. I understand, we want to stakehold different ideas, but I just wanted to flag the additional burden piece on folks, because sometimes, I see all the time in my work, people don't know to request for accommodations, or that an accommodation exists, so that they should request it. So I have concerns about that. I do think, and this is my lawyer brain coming out a little bit, these are contracts, and contracts do require some terms of art and some legal language. So the way I've been kind of thinking about this, and I looked at the Kelsey's design standards, and they actually have something about accessible lease agreements in there. And they also suggest it as more of like an addendum, explanatory page that's simplified. So I would suggest that as an option, that there is, a lease agreement, but maybe there's a template way to describe a security deposit, stuff like that the state could develop and landlords could adopt and modify while keeping the language plain and including it with their lease agreements.
I think that's a really interesting idea, Cassidy. I also, and again, I'm offering no opinions on what you should or should not stakehold, I do want to bring us back to what this task force was created to address. And it's very specific to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure, affordable, accessible, and attainable housing for persons with disabilities. And we are to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. Yes, part of that will have to be what is doable and feasible, but as you've heard me say before, and I'm going to keep beating this drum, there is nobody who is going to take your ideas and say, you know what, let's make that even more bold and aspirational. At every stage, it's likely to be pushed back against, it's likely to be watered down. I'm going to push you to do two things: to be as aspirational as possible and to be as aggressive as possible in getting stakeholders to give us their opinions on all of these ideas. Let me go to Rep Ortiz and then Karen and then Paul.
Yep. Thanks, Barrick. And your comment and the last one really tee up what I'm gonna say is, yes, we need to identify where burdens are gonna be. But what this task force is not, in order to be functional, what it's not gonna do is then decide not to do it, right? Like that is, so if you're identifying something as a burden, then what are the solutions? What resources can the state or can others bring to reduce that burden? Because the bottom line is, for those of us that don't have developmental disabilities, lease agreements, we can look at any apartment, at any condo we want, and be able to understand what we're getting into. That is the type of equity that we're trying to secure for people with disabilities. So, I would lean into saying, the plain language for everyone, everywhere, full stop, dot, period. Okay, so how do we get there? Is that needing to have the state through a certain department give resources to help create a template so that businesses can use that and utilize that, understanding that they also can make it their own if they want to, and then giving them guidelines on a resource website of what plain language is, right? Like, and then they can submit it to see if it's approved or not. Like, those are the type of solutions that we need to be hearing. Saying, oh, that's going to be a burden. That's not what this task force is for. That is not what your mission is. That is not what your purpose is. We've gotten enough of that as people with disabilities, and I've gotten enough of that as a legislator. It's yours to try and find solutions.
Thank you, Rep Ortiz. Karen and then Paul.
I think going back to the aspirational that you just mentioned, Barrick, I liked the idea that was thrown out earlier of the hotline, and actually having, maybe it's a disclosure on, or maybe the requirement is on all the leases, it says, to make this accessible, to make it understandable, to make the plain language that here is a resource. I just know in some cases, even with, again, leases and mortgages, they're complicated for all of us, I think. And so I do like the toolkit idea that I think somebody mentioned originally. Oh, Brian, I just got the speaking language too. That must be a thing today in Zoom about what language I'm speaking. But yes, I think some sort of, again, aspirational hotline where you can actually have somebody to talk back and forth with it, or and not just see it and try to, again, interpret it yourself, and some sort of potential disclosure or statement on contracts that say this is available.
Thank you. Paul, what are you thinking about?
I think it came up a few months ago, but plainlanguage.gov looks like it's a federal website. There was a Plain Writing Act of 2010, and they've published guidelines on, we could probably use this as a state, as a structure to define what it means to be plain language.
So, and Paul, this is where I'm going to be asking questions like, is water wet? Just because I want to make sure I'm never trying to put words in anyone's mouth. Would the suggestion be that the state require plain language that is consistent with the federal guidance offered on plainlanguage.gov?
It'd probably be consistent with the Plain Writing Act of 2010.
Okay.
or any subsequent amendments to that, I would assume. So.
Yep, thank you. I'm going to move us into some of the other areas in a minute or two. I want to make sure that we've really heard from everyone on the topic of plain language in contracts and agreements. We've talked about lease agreements, we've talked about purchase agreements, mortgages, contracts or agreements with HOAs. Are there any other ideas you all may want to socialize in this specific area around the accessibility? And we're talking about multiple forms of accessibility, plain language, format and form, and compatibility with readers. Anything else on the accessibility of contracts and agreements? Okay, and of course, as this call continues, if something comes up, we will circle back to it. I want to move into communications about units and rights. And let's separate this a little bit. We've had a couple of different conversations around communications about available, accessible, or adaptable units. Before we go into the communications about individuals' rights, which is a broader topic, let's dig into what might be some solutions, again, in the terms of the role of the state. And the role of the state may be requiring things. It may be, as we've just bantied about, that the state provides models of things. When it comes to communications about available, accessible units, what ideas do you all have that we may want to socialize? Paul.
I don't know specifics yet, but websites like apartments.com, there's a ton of information. That's, I guess, where I would assume a lot of people start their journey. And when you browse details on there, there's nothing really talking about the accessibility features. Does a building have an elevator? Or any of those? It's going to say if a property has a pool, but it would seem pretty easy to add some of those trickle downs, like does it have an elevator, et cetera.
So, and Shelley, I see your hand up. I'm going to call on you next. I want to dig on this one, Paul, with you and with everyone. It strikes me that there are probably a dozen ways the state could address that. The state could require anyone leasing properties in the state of Colorado to include all accessibility information in their listing. The state could require any internet service that markets units in the state of Colorado to include and require that information. The state could require that of any developer, property management, commercial or individual. So are there things that you want to put on the table, recognizing I'm not proposing or suggesting anything, I just rambled off. I'm just talking about the scope of what could be. What do you see the state might want to do, or you'd like to hear from stakeholders their thoughts on?
Looking at the failed bill from last year, since it focused on mandating minimum percentages of type A and type B units, I would hope you'd at least publish the quantity of available type A and type B units.
And so your idea, and again, this is just me making sure I don't assume anything, would be to require any listing to include the numbers of type A and type B units.
Yeah, right now it's just listed as, Studio 1. It's 919 square feet.
I gotcha. And thank you for indulging me asking really narrow and at times obvious questions. I want to leave this open to everyone to weigh in on ideas of what you might want to suggest the state could do, could require, could provide when it comes to communicating about what are the accessibility features or availability. Shelley, you've had your hand up, though.
Yeah. So, Barrick, I'm going back to the statute, and we're talking about affordable housing, and so when someone's looking for affordable housing, I mean, that's one aspect of it. I think apartments.com is great, and we do market with them, but folks go to 211, Mile High United Way's 211 for affordable housing. They go to Chaffa's site because they list all of the multifamily developments that have that are affordable. And then, I think even Housing Colorado could be a resource for individuals. And I say that because I know Brian's on the line here, but so you think about, when folks are thinking about affordable housing, who are those key players in the market that are not only funding, but could be a resource in determining what's affordable and also accessible. So if you go to those sites, like how are we determining, it could be very similar to when you're marketing it on a website, are they showing what type of units are available that would be accessible?
And Shelley and Rep. Ortiz, I see your hand up. I'll call on you next. Shelley, do you have an idea of what the state might want to do? Is it a matter of state-owned websites or partnered sites, whether that's something like CHAFA or DOH, are required to include that information? Is it a broader state requirement that everyone, or is it the state create a new website and directory of affordable, accessible housing with all accessibility details?
Good question. I think if you're going to, not trying to, it would be if the states are reporting the units, there should be some level of being able to share what is accessible of those units. They have the data, in.
Thanks. Rep. Ortiz. You're muted, sir, right now.
As a subcommittee member, I can't make any, motions or recommendations, but we're here to be aspirational. So I think any entity, whether it's the state, whether it's apartments.com, any entity that lists or is a listing or utilized for listing, Zillow, whatever, and if they operate in the state of Colorado, then if they give overall features of their building, then they must also say what is accessible in that building. If they give features of any individual unit, then they also must be make it so that accessible features are searchable and readable and available. And we've done this before with car rental companies like Hertz. We passed a bill doing this already for them. And we just recently passed a bill mandating this for peer-to-peer car rental companies like Turo and Get a Ride, right? So this is something that we have done. There's a precedent for it. I think this is something that we should do so that people can look up places to live, whether they're specific affordable through Mile High or whether they are general market units through apartments.com, whatever that may be, that they can search by accessible features and get an overall feel for how accessible the area is that they're trying to think about moving into.
Thank you. And Rep. Ortiz, I so appreciate all of your expertise and work on this and our joint view on this parliamentary procedure. As he emphasized, he's a member of the executive committee, he's vice chair, so he's having a discussion with you. Is there a member of this subcommittee who would like to suggest that we socialize the idea of requiring any listing? Karen, I see your hand up. We are now adding that to the list, and thank you. Let me go to Brian, and then Karen, and then Cassidy.
Well, I think Rep. Ortiz kind of beat me to what I was saying, and I think Karen's hand was raised as well. But I think, finding the way forward for the state to mandate something that is included in advertisement, I think is a possibility, and it's one that perhaps isn't that burdensome for the landlords involved, right? This, while it does have a positive outcome that we'd hope for, it's not something that's you're going to have to build all of these. You're going to have to comply with sort of building a certain amount of unit. There's something to me that says that there's some ease to this, that compliance, may be something that is easily completed or contemplated. So,
understood. Thank you. And to be clear, my intention is as we go socialize these ideas, and let's take this one as an example. You may get feedback of, well, we would need this time, or there's this cost, or you may hear from a lot of people, we love this idea. one of the things you all will need to contemplate as we refine these recommendations this fall is what is the means of enforcement and compliance? Is this a situation where if someone doesn't comply, there's a fine? Is it if you don't, you're not allowed to do business in the state? Don't need to go there now, but what I wanted to emphasize is we're going to get a lot deeper into how these get implemented and enforced as we move these forward. Let's go to Karen and then Cassidy.
Sorry, I unmuted myself. I feel like a lot of what I was going to say was said. I really, it was Paul's suggestion in terms of that, and I think it is a great, easy suggestion, and that's why I raised my hand adamantly when physically raised my hand when Rep Ortiz said that, and Barrick, you asked for a suggestion. So I definitely think that that's great, and I appreciate hearing the examples that have already been in place to do that. And Barrick, I also was going to mention the compliance piece, because I always know that that's like the next question of who is going to do that. And then I just wanted to tag on what Shelley's conversation in terms of DOLA, the Division of Housing. You know, when we're applying for grants and subsidies and loans, they are asking us what accessible units that we're doing. And so Shelley clearly said that data is available. So let's get that data out there. That's the piece that I think is missing, and having that easily accessible in one location to show what's available based off of that data that they're already collecting.
Thank you, Karen. And good reminder about what DOH is already collecting in a lot of situations. Cassidy and then Paul, please.
I was just going to chime in with like another point for the requirement that Rep Ortiz suggested, that it be included when, you know, in building descriptions and in unit descriptions. Because I think like a big takeaway I had from our last subcommittee meeting when hearing from folks at the Kelsey is like reframing this whole concept of like accessibility features make a place more desirable, and getting that in people's minds. And I think having it marketed as a feature of this apartment would kind of help change the narrative and change those perspectives. So I just wanted to underscore that as well as something that I think is less, I don't know, tangible, I guess, but like something I think that is important for the subcommittee to be doing, which is changing the norms and the perspectives around accessibility as well.
Thank you, Cassidy. Paul.
In the spirit of specificity, as somebody said, Chaffa, they link to a website called coloradohousingsearch.com. And the listing descriptions on that website are a good first draft. They start to talk about counter heights and the approach to the unit entry. Could definitely be expanded on, but just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Paul. So far, we've put some, I think, clear ideas on the table when it comes to contracts. We've dug into communications about the units and their features and their functionality. Before I move us on to some next topics, anything else here? Somebody mentioned advertising. And again, this is not me trying to suggest any ideas, but is there anything that you believe should be required in advertising of units? Beyond what we've been talking about the accessibility features, are there, and I guess we've been talking about availability listings, anything else you want to cover here? Rep Ortiz.
I just want to make sure like we go back to being specific about like accommodations of a building itself. So I just want to be so that we're very clear on what we're talking about. Number of available accessible parking spots if you're in an apartment building, number of elevators per building, or which buildings do and don't have elevators, right? Common rooms like laundry rooms, are they accessible? Common rooms like mail rooms, are they accessible or not? Common rooms like pools or amenities, are they accessible or not? Like these are things that if the apartment is going to list at all, the complex, like advertise for it, or anyone's going to list it at all or advertise for any part of the building, then they also must be required to talk about what is accessible.
Understood. And we will include all of that specific detail in the idea when we socialize it and be very clear as that moves forward. Paul.
Just second what Representative Ortiz said, but it jogged a thought. I'm pretty certain when apartment communities are bought and sold from, the big money people to the next big money person, they conduct an accessibility report on each property to confirm compliance with federal and state laws. I don't know if that's just a requirement of the equity, just being careful to make sure they're not buying something that's in non-conformance, or if it's a deeper requirement, but that's a report and a process that can seemingly blaze a trail for, I don't know, it's generating information at the minimum that can be used to be put into these listings.
So, Paul, and I will clearly state, I don't know, what that process or form is, and whether it's, to your point, required or incidental to the process. Is there something that you think should be required that it take place, or that it be logged or reported, or where the data warehouse somewhere?
I think it's a reasonable thing to expect that if an apartment trades ownership, that report is generated, if it's not already required. That way, at least the current status is documented, and any non-conformances, but that report is often used, in my experience, to create scope of works that we're required to then go and remedy.
Rep. Ortiz, obviously some thoughts here.
I'm so excited. Like it's, I don't want, I mean, this might make me sound arrogant, but it's rare that I hear a complete, like a no-brainer idea that I myself didn't think of. This is a done, like we do, like when we're selling apartments, like you talk about like, oh, the roof is damaged, you're gonna have to repair it, or it's not up to fire code, based on new codes or whatever. Like we do this for all the other things, for able-bodied safety and for liability and for cost for the new owners. This is a no-brainer. Like this is awesome idea. I can't push forward ideas. I am just, thanks, Paul. This is like, that is chef's kiss.
Thank you. I'm going to take us to some topics that came up at the start of our call. It continues to be open to everyone to build on ideas you're hearing or things that come to mind. I will tell you that the two other ideas I noted that I heard from folks were around templates and other resources, and then this idea of a clearinghouse on rights when it relates to housing. I want to first talk about templates and resources. We did start off with talking about a number of paths forward on plain language contracts, and one of those may be the state providing a model contract that is plain language, that is accessible. Are there other templates or resources relating to affordable, accessible housing that you think would start removing some barriers if the state took a role in providing or requiring?
So Barrick, this is Shelley. I guess I want to go back to Paul's comment, but also, are there other, what came to mind for me is like with some developments that have HUD financing, the Department of HUD has requirements around if you're doing improvements or what any needs that have to be made, they do look at accessibility, and that is documented. If you're looking to refinance it or take on new debt, you have to meet certain requirements. And I don't know that, how do you garner, how do you gather what is HUD requiring of some of these developments, that to ensure. I just wanted to put that out there because I do, that is whether you're selling it, refinancing, whatever that may look like, they do have requirements that could prompt another, the need for improvements.
Thanks, Shelley. Any other thoughts, either building on those ideas or on this other idea of, are there templates related to accessing housing that you have not seen available that the state could play a role? I'm going to give us room to come back to it. I want to dig a little on this idea that was floated around a clearinghouse, or I've come to hate the phrase one-stop shop because it seems to be used for everything, but a simple place, an accessible place for individuals to go get information about their rights related to housing and accessible housing, and what their rights are and how to enforce them. Does anyone want to paint some color to that picture, or fill in some details on what you think we may want to socialize as a potential strategy to get reaction? Cassidy, jump in.
I like the idea of like short explanatory videos to explain like some key concepts. So there could be one on like reasonable accommodations. There could be one on reasonable modifications, and kind of distilling like what individuals' rights are in that space. One on like animals in housing. Is it an emotional support? Is it a service animal? What does that mean? So I like having these videos. I think they're a really clear and digestible way to understand information. And as far as like a place to kind of house them all, I don't know. I have the one idea I can think of would be like where the Colorado Civil Rights Division videos are, because that's where Coloradans go to enforce these rights, aside from HUD. But yeah, I'm open to other ideas on that. That's just a half-baked thought.
Yeah, and we can certainly continue to bake this, and whether it lands at CCRD or the new CDU office that was formed this past session, Colorado Disabilities Office. I do want to just make sure that I'm consistent with all of our work. You mentioned videos. I'm guessing you didn't mean to intend to limit just to videos, but rather the idea of modules around different aspects of rights and how to access them, and probably doing it in different formats for different individuals.
Yes, I think that different formats are great. I did want to highlight videos specifically as an idea, because I think their handouts are great. There are other resources that are great, but I think videos work for a lot of people. So I wanted to highlight that specifically.
Yeah, I'm not taking away from videos. I just want to make sure you weren't meaning to limit it to only videos. Yeah. Okay.
So Barrick, to that point, I mean, I think how could technology be a resource? So videos being one, but what other forms of technology could we utilize that? I mean, I think to represent Representative Ortiz's comments, like what are those aspirational, how do we think outside the box? But technology continues to advance. So how are we utilizing that to really get messaging and resources out to individuals that would have a need?
Yeah. Thanks, Shelley. I want folks to feel free in the remainder of this call to come back to any of these ideas around contracts, their plain language and their accessibility, around communications in particular. Paul, let me go to you, and then I'll throw a prompt out to the whole group.
I think this ties to what we were just talking about, but do you have to be registered by DORA to rent units? That seems to be an avenue of maintaining minimum standards or categorizing everybody doing this.
I don't know the answer. I will come back to you with what I can learn. I don't know, Shelley, if there's anything you've experienced with private property owners versus commercial, and the registration or regulation of the rental space.
Yeah, I need to go back to our property management team, but nothing is standing out. If someone comes in and they need an accommodation, we're working with them and they usually provide something in writing from a provider. That's what would trigger it for us.
Yeah, Paul, and again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't work for Dora, but I will go find out. I don't believe it's neither a regulated profession and I don't believe it's a licensed industry. Are you raising the question of should it be?
It seems like it might need to be if there's minimum requirements to list your property, to built into the contract, etc. That if I were to rent my house, I guess, and I had to get a license, that's where I would start, and it'd be a natural way to kind of download to those landlords all those requirements.
I don't know if anyone, I know there are certainly some municipalities that will take the step of requiring, registration or licensing of short-term rentals. I don't know on the long-term rentals. Does anyone have any information? Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to recall back to when we were small scale landlords for my in-laws place before they moved here. I think in Denver, you have to register with the city as a landlord at this point, even I think on a small scale, but I do not believe in, and don't hold me to this, and I'm going to hold your feet to the fire, Barrick, on getting the information, but I don't believe that there's a statewide registry for landlords.
There's not. City of Boulder's required apartments to be licensed. So is Denver. There's probably other municipalities that have some sort of requirement for licensing, which typically would include some kind of minimal inspection of the units for that license period, however long that licensing might be. But I know that Denver has had trouble getting everybody to get their license. But there is no statewide requirement. I think it'd be hard to do it statewide. And I think that costs a lot of money you could charge enough on the licenses to support it, which is what a lot of licensing entities do, is the license fees support the inspection and compliance. But I don't know if that would drive some landlords out of the market too.
And I don't want us for right now to get into, stress testing what the economic impact would be. If someone wants to socialize that idea, I will open it up if anyone else puts that on the table. Not hearing it right now, but I will leave it open to folks. We've got some good ideas here. I'm going to shift it a little bit for the next 10 minutes. We've really focused on removing barriers by state action, whether through the regulatory environment or through statute and legal requirements. Throughout our time together, we've also talked about generating recommendations of things that are just good to do, whether because it's the right thing to do or it's a best practice to do so. So I open the door now. Are there other things that you believe, again, when it comes to this whole spectrum of accessing information about units, contracts, and communications, that you're not ready to say, I want to consider the state requiring or the state regulating or the state doing, but are there anything you want to put out there as best practices for the developers or for the landlords?
Eric, this is Shelley, and I did want to go back to the comment around, and I'm sorry to do that to you.
No,
again,
jump back, please.
You're asking a question, but I did. So to the point, City and County of Denver does require any rental housing, and you can go to their site and pull it up, but residential rental properties, they do require, they passed an ordinance in 2021, and this is a way to create standards. what I don't know is, and so there's resources for property owners, inspections and inspector information, just a lot of different resources. So they are requiring, and it sounds like Boulder is, but that, does it make sense for us to look at that broadly across the state to really understand what that looks like across the state would be informative. I think that's been the challenge of this task of this committee, of trying to figure out what's the inventory, what's the excessive. I mean, we have not been able to put our thumb on that yet. And so I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, and Shelley, so our next meeting is going to be going deep on data. What data exists, what data we want to require, what data we're going to recommend be collected and developed. And as part of that conversation, we're going to start talking percentages of units. Rep. Ortiz, I'm going to bring you in just 1 second. I do also want to just react to what Shelley said. As I'm hearing you, I could hear 3 directions this group could go with potential solutions. You could say the state should require all rental units to be registered and licensed. You could require that based on a property manager with a minimum number of units. You could suggest that any jurisdiction that is licensing require this information to be reported, or you could say it's a best practice that if you're licensing, collect this information. So I'll put that range of ideas you all might want to put on the table while I go to Rep. Ortiz.
Thank you, Beric. And as you guys enter into that data conversation, like if you say that we don't have enough data, then, or anyone says that, then I would hope that the subcommittee then proposes a solution on how to collect that. That being said, we do have enough federal data to know there is not enough stock of type A or type B units, because there's federal data out there that says across the country, out of type A, only 3%, type B, less than 1%, or the other way around, right? Like that data out there is out there and exists. We know that 20 to 25% of people across the country live with a disability, visible or invisible, and that includes people that are aging above the age of 65 that need a mobility device. We know that this is a problem. We know that the current stock does not meet that. So any increase, whether it's 5%, whether it's 10%, we shouldn't be afraid to tie it to a number. If you're not willing, if this subcommittee is not willing to make the recommendation to do 20, because they're like, well, we don't even know if we need that many. Well, I can tell you, I know we need more than 1 or 3%. And I can tell you, as someone that has done apartment searching, that has done housing search, that we need more than 1 or 3%. And like these other recommendations that you guys listed, whether it's when an apartment sells, that they list accessible features, that when it's listed at all, when they're trying to rent it out, that it lists accessible unit. This will help us get to the data, right? This will help us get better data for the state. And so if that's a part of the calculation of, well, we don't have exactly the data, we're going to tie it to 10% or 5% of units must be blah, at least to start with. And these other things that we're recommending will help us get to the data. And you can even build that into the recommendation. In 5 or 10 years from now, we recommend that the CDU office look at what we've recommended and try and quantify what percentage we have, and then convene a new task force, right? Like you got to think creatively about what you're trying to do here. It's not just, oh, we don't have that data. Well, we know that there's not enough units. That we know. We know that there's 1% or less of type A. We know that there's 3% or less of type B across the country, right? So just want to make sure that we don't not act just because we don't have perfect data. There's a reason we don't have data, and that's because whether it's intentional or not, people don't see people with disabilities. And that's the bottom. And it's this task force's job to solve that problem.
Thank you, Representative. And I think, frankly, I'm probably going to cut that video because that's the intro to our agenda for our next meeting, is to talk about what data we do have, what data we don't have, what data we can extrapolate from, and what you're comfortable recommending, requiring now, and how that may adjust as you collect, as the state gathers more data. So that's exactly where we'll be going in our next meeting. In the next few minutes, I want to leave this question open of, in addition to the state providing model contracts, in addition to the state requiring the reporting, the disclosure, and the searchability of some information, including by those operating in our state, are there any other best practices you would recommend to landlords, developers, housing authorities, or others in today's conversation about accessibility of information and the contracts for gaining housing? Paul.
I think there might need to be a training component to on-site people who are showing properties to prospective residents or selling properties to prospective residents. You know, these resources have to be communicated to those prospective residents. They need to know, you know, if they omit saying something or don't notice it's kind of, it's not malice, but it doesn't help, just like if somebody was like withholding all that information. So they're kind of the front line. And I don't know, we architects have continuing ed requirements every year. I think real estate professionals do as well, but these agents on the front line of, you know, these communities, I don't know if they do or not.
So let's workshop a little bit, and Paul, you can offer the ideas, or I'll invite others. What should happen? Should the state provide this training? Should the state require this training? Should the state say, if you are a leasing company with minimum of X units, you must, you should, it's a good idea? What do we think should happen, given that this task force's job is to remove barriers? And clearly a barriers, we've got some people showing units that you're saying that aren't quite up to speed with that.
I guess I don't know. And before I answer your question, I'd call to help my task force friends and see if they know some of the existing, is there training, are there existing requirements already?
Let me bring in Shelley and Brian and ask if either of you.
So depending on the type of, so there is training, and I would say hiring someone to be a property manager, the training that they are required to go through requires a number of certifications, and I can, for this task force, provide some of what that looks like. But is there training specific? And you know, it's fair housing training. It's a lot of the, you know, when you're an affordable housing operator, owner, you do have to abide by a number of laws. But what does that look like for accessibility and someone with disability? I can explore what that training looks like. But there are certifications and a significant amount of training that they go through. So we can't just, when we're thinking about recruiting, it's not like you can post a position. You're looking for someone that brings a skill set that really understands the complexity of leasing agent or property manager and have certain certifications.
Thanks, Shelley.
So then maybe looking at, sorry, Paul, I was going to
No,
say,
you go.
Maybe looking at what those certifications currently are, and if there is, you know, where the gaps are in terms of making sure they have the tools and the resources to be able, as like the leasing agent, they have the training they need. So it sounds like maybe there's an outlet already for this, but maybe the necessary training isn't part of that. I think that's maybe a missing piece, Barrick, that either you and Shelley could provide for us to potentially make a recommendation towards.
Shelley, I'd love to connect with you, and Carrie and I will also get with the research team at DORA and see what we can pull from the state lens on this. We've got about 15 minutes. I normally would be shifting to public comment. As you all on the screen can see, we don't have members of the public present. I am saying that because we are being live streamed on YouTube, and I don't want anywhere and out there in internet land to think we are not providing that opportunity. We don't have anyone on the line looking for public comment. I want to provide everyone the opportunity for final thoughts. I'll then give us some next steps, but I'm not going to force you to stick around for 15 minutes simply because we have it on calendars. But I do want to make sure, again, let's come back to our charge of removing barriers to accessing affordable, accessible housing. Today's conversation around contracting and communications. Are there any closing or additional thoughts? And Paul, I see your hand up.
I think it was maybe in an overall spirit of communication, plain language, maybe Colorado Housing or something has a website or a clearinghouse.
Yeah.
And they hold the templates, they hold the training, they hold design resources, they hold directories for specialized consultants that can help do these accessibility assessments, etc.
Cassidy.
Something I was just thinking of too as an idea, is like maybe a resource for like tenants themselves who want support, kind of going to like the plain language and like accessible documents idea. If they need support, like distilling the language, like not legal advice, but like just this is like what it says, and this is like what this document's communicating. I was just trying to think of like if there could be maybe in like, I don't know, I keep coming back to like Centers for Independent Living or something like that, like a person who is a resource to kind of walk through complex documents as well. So that was just something I've been thinking about.
Thank you, Cassidy. Sorry, I kept myself on mute there. Thank you. Let me kind of, Karen, jump in, please.
I was just gonna say, I think, Cassidy, that was my comment earlier about the hotline and the person. That's the direction that I was going in, is having some sort of back and forth opportunity versus a passive opportunity of reading something. So again, I feel like that's aspirational. I'm not sure about the how and the who and the all of that, but I think, there's there's counseling for homeowners, like trying to when you're looking to buy a house, or, I guess, again, what resources might already be out there too that we could tap into and make sure it's incorporated. But yeah.
Karen and Cassidy, let me push a little with both of you, or if anybody else wants to jump in. What might we want to consider as a state action on this? I know we talked about this clearinghouse or this place where folks could go to get information about these. This is more about a live person as a navigator to help people understand. Is the idea, or what might you propose? Because I could see a range from this being an additional role that we ask someone in, whether it's CDU or over at Division of Housing, or is it identifying who these are in the nonprofit and NGO space and including those services in a directory? Are you suggesting that navigator role should be something the state provides, or that we highlight where others do it?
This is Cassidy. I'm in favor of the state providing something. And the reason I'm kind of, it gives me pause to go the other route is that I don't know if anyone is clearly doing this type of work for our folks who are envisioning would utilize this. And I know like Centers for Independent Living, other organizations are completely overburdened. So that's what's giving me pause there, and why I think creating something for this would perhaps be better.
Got it. Brian, I think I saw you coming off mute. Is it something you wanted to weigh in on?
Well, sort of thinking the opposite direction, just knowing the burdens that the state has, and thinking in terms of like what happened this year with some of like the legal representation field is that the state did pass some money for groups like the Community Economic Defense Project to do legal work around housing issues for folks. And so I don't know, like we might not have the right NGO nonprofit quite yet, but I'm also, you know, while I don't want to be critical of the state, I know the state is not as flexible sometimes. Perhaps that's a good way of putting it. Is not as flexible to and adaptable as perhaps an NGO is to be able to maneuver when when they need to.
Thanks, Brian. David.
So, in my work at Centers for Independent Living in California, housing is a state required service. Housing coordination there. It isn't not in Colorado, but honestly, if the state puts some money into requiring Centers for Independent Living to provide housing coordination as well as the AAAs to cover both seniors and people with disabilities. That would be something that would give an easily recognizable place for a lot of people to go to. And it's something that already some of the centers do a tremendous amount of work around housing, helping people find housing. And I know the AAAs do the same, but the reality is if they had a little extra money, they could do a lot better job.
Thanks, David. Karen?
I'm not so sure now hearing David's comment. I might change, but I think I was going to, in terms of should it be a state, should it be a nonprofit or another entity, leaning towards the state only because of that consistency piece and making sure that everyone had access to it. I mean, if you're in a community across, in a smaller community across Colorado that doesn't have the nonprofit resources or the resources to provide it. But again, if it was at a state level, I feel like that could be, that would be equitable access across the state versus, I don't know, maybe in the Denver area, it would be easier to find some sort of resource versus another location. Although I know as I say that, I'm a processor. I mean, obviously we have online and things like that, but I would want it to be available statewide. And I think that's why some sort of statewide entity is what my original kind of thought was.
So, again, as I've said over the last 90 minutes, this is not me trying to suggest anything, but I'm hearing what could be a range of ideas you may be socialized, ranging from the state create a position in an appropriate division or department to provide these navigation services. At the other end of the spectrum, the state could provide technical support and information to third parties doing so, or in the middle, the state could provide grant or other funding to third parties to provide these services. Again, not me advocating for any one or all of those, but are any of those ideas that you would like to socialize with stakeholders to get reaction?
I mean, I would be okay I don't know if we can socialize multiple ideas. I would be okay socializing all of them. The one thing that I heard, Barrick, was the common theme was the state had a role, whether it was providing money and contracting with other entities to do it, whether they created a position. So I think what was important about what you said in all these examples is that there was some sort of state oversight or state role, which I think needs to be in place. But I guess I would be okay socializing all of the above that you said, just to see I guess what kind of shakes out or gives us time to process it as well.
And we could do it as a single concept and ask stakeholders to respond with what they see as the strengths or implications or concerns of any one or more of those models, if that's what you all would like to do. Does that feel right to folks to include that spectrum of ideas as a single concept to socialize? I'm seeing some nodding heads. So
Derek, can you just confirm, like, are we trying to get this completed by before the next meeting?
so here is, I'm glad you're asking, because at 12:23, it's a perfect time for me to wrap up the conversation with what we're going to do. Yes. So what Carrie and I are going to do is take today's conversation and over the next 7 to 10 days, clean it up into a distilled set of ideas. Some of them are individual solutions to barriers. Some of them are ranges of approaches to those. We will circulate those back to you, not to ask for you to add new ideas, just to make sure that we captured them correctly and we didn't goof up on any of the wording. Our intention will be over the next 2 weeks then to get those ideas up on Engage Dora, and we'll ask all of you to share the link to that with your networks. We'll also be doing the same with the full task force and all of the other subcommittees. So today's goal is just to get brainstorm. Carrie and I will clean them up, circulate them back out to you, and then we want to get them up on Engage Dora over the next 2 weeks so we can socialize them with stakeholders. Did I get it what you were wondering, Shelley? Okay, so that's actually my wrap up on where we're going to go with this. At our next meeting, and I'm saving a few minutes because Carrie needs to go over a little bit of scheduling. Our next meeting is going to get a little heavy and in the weeds. As Rep. Ortiz outlined for me very eloquently, we're going to be talking about the numbers. We're going to be talking about what data is available, where you think there needs to be requirements for additional data to be collected, at what level and in what ways. And based on what we do know, what you're prepared to include as potential solutions in terms of requirements for different types of units. And does that scale as we get more information and data in? So our next meeting really will be about what data we have, what data we want, what data we need, and what do you want to require when it comes to the numbers of units. Following that, at a later meeting, we'll get into the financing side, and then we'll continue with the rest of the conversations. Rep. Ortiz, you've got your hand up before I bring Carrie in on scheduling.
Carrie can go first. I just want to wrap up with a comment whenever it's appropriate.
You got it. Thanks. Carrie.
Thanks, Rep. Yep. Just in terms of July, we had all, you guys all completed the survey, the one subcommittee where everybody did it. So thank you very much. It looks like everybody is available to meet in person and or hybrid. So a majority of folks look like they could meet sometime morning between 8 and 10 as a start time. I'll also circulate a few afternoon options, but I'm going to send you all a scheduling poll to see if we can find an agreeable time. Then we will nail down a location so we can figure out when and where this will all happen. But this will be, I just got the language thing. This will replace our regular monthly meeting. So we'll do a deep dive at that 3 or 4 hour meeting.
Thanks, Carrie. Rep. Ortiz, final words.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time and talent. I've been keeping my distance from the subcommittees for the most part, just because I wanted you all to bring your ideas, your expertise, your strength. As we're getting closer to decision time and recommendation time, it's been asked of all members of the executive committee to kind of just listen in, offer guidance where needed, or also to be able to kind of be that bridge when it goes from answering to then going to the executive committee. So this is all just to say I appreciate your time and talent. I'm very bolstered by the discussion I heard here today and some of the ideas I put forward. Not that you need my affirmation, but it did me really good to be a part of this meeting today. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thank you, Rep. Ortiz. Thank you, everyone on the call. We'll follow up by email, and we'll look forward to seeing hopefully a lot of you in person in July, and those that can't, at least seeing you on screen. Have a great rest of the week and a great weekend.